Welcome back, everyone, to the Mind Body Detox podcast. I'm your host, Kara Lovehart, and we are going to be interviewing Jennie Ketcham Crooks today. And she is the founder of West Coast Anxiety Clinic, a licensed clinical social worker, and an anxiety and OCD specialist. So prior to starting the West Coast Anxiety Clinic, Jennie was the director of clinical education at Seattle Anxiety Specialists, and before that, the lead medical social worker at the Polyclinic. And then Jennie has been involved in research at the University of Washington, a guest lecturer at Harvard University, and appeared on a number of popular television shows, including Headline News, The View, and Oprah. And so this topic, so we're saying, okay, anxiety, OCD, what are we going into today? Drum roll, please, guys. We're going to talk about overcoming digital addiction. So that is a huge topic. It is something that it creeps up on us. And so we're really excited to bring her on and chat with her today about this particular topic. Hi, Jennie.
Hi, Kara. So excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I'm curious as far as your journey first to start off here, really what brought you into specializing in OCD and anxiety, and then kind of moving into this topic of anxiety connected with digital and overuse of media.
Yeah, great question. So what brought me into specializing in anxiety and OCD? So I have my own historical struggle. I mean, like so many of us have my own historical struggle with anxiety. And for me, before I became a therapist, I was actually in the porn business. And I had this very narrow idea of what was possible in my life. And the fear of failing and trying something else, or of, there was this line in my head. It's like, well, who would ever take me seriously after doing porn, right? And that very narrow um, possibility really limited my life. So I saw anxiety show up in a lot of ways in my younger years, and it kept me in a business much longer than I think was actually appropriate. So when I left porn, I did so through a very public way. I was on sex rehab with Dr. Drew, and then I did sober house with Dr. Drew, and I got sober and got to, another anxious thing, right? Like, what happens if I don't drink Jack Daniels and smoke weed all day? It turns out you just have feelings and can like not detonate every relationship you're in, which is really great for me. Um, so, so all of that led me to this place where it's like, oh well, being a change maker, being able to support people and work with them as they make changes in their life, that's a really meaningful thing for me. And
Yeah.
so when I graduated with my master's in social work, I started working in primary care as this initial touch point. I would think of myself as like the springboard into longer care for a lot of the patients who were coming in. And what I noticed was that a lot of the patients who were coming in and seeing me frequently, they were very concerned about their health, but in a way that was sort of dysfunctional, right? Like they were coming to visit a lot, or they were having these symptoms that were mysterious and scary to them, but the physicians weren't necessarily identifying it as anxiety, right? Like they were sort of like always on edge, or like hyper vigilant, or really irritable. And with a little bit more training, I started to realize like, oh, this is like, there's some OCD happening here, or there's PTSD happening here, or this is like health anxiety, right? Illness anxiety disorder. And so being in primary care really opened my eyes to the ways in which just every day we are suffering with anxiety. And so I joined a private practice, and teaching has always been really important to me as well. I was a teacher when I was in porn. I would produce like instructional videos with Vivid, and so that has been something that has carried forward in my life. And I've done a lot of training in being a clinical social worker as well. So yeah, so I started working in private practice, and eventually, the treatment for anxiety or OCD is to do the things that terrify you, really. And opening my own practice has always terrified me, and so I was like, oh crap, like we're gonna need to go toward that. We're gonna need to do that, aren't we? And so I opened the West Coast Anxiety Clinic. So that's sort of the long and short of how I got to opening the clinic. When it comes to digital overuse, which is really how I'm conceptualizing it, I came to this very specific focus by two ways. And the first was I started seeing a lot of my clients using their devices, whether it's a smartphone or a tablet. I started seeing them using it as an eject button from uncomfortable situations, right? So in the elevator, I don't know where to look. I don't know whether I'm supposed to talk to this person next to me. I'm just going to look at my phone, right? Or standing at the bus stop. I don't know what this person's going to do next to me. I don't know this. I'm just going to look at my phone. Or waiting in a meeting for the meeting to start, like, oh God, what's the person's name next to me? Like, I don't know, I'm just gonna look at my phone, right? So this like really easy way to get away from feeling uncomfortable or anxious.
Yeah.
And so all of my clients, I started putting on like a digital nutrition plan, right? Like, what are the things in the phone that are nourishing for you, right? And then what are the things that are just sucking the life out of you, right? Like, is endless scrolling on Instagram, looking at other women's bodies and comparing them to yours really getting you to the gym? I don't know. I just don't think so, right? Like, I'm making a wild guess. And I had really thought about it in terms of that, like psychopathology avoidance framework, right? Like, this is something that people are using to escape. And then I had this moment in my own personal life where my older daughter, she's 6.5 now, but she was just starting to walk then. And she was like toddling across the coffee table, and we were having a Super Bowl party. And I had one of those errant thoughts that show up, right, about Snooki, because who doesn't just randomly think about Snooki from Jersey Shore? Right? So I thought about Snooki. I was like, what is she doing? Like, I must know her net worth immediately. And so I dove into my phone and started looking. And if you give me a little bit of Snooki, like, I'm definitely going to want to know about the sitch. Like, I need to know what he's doing. I love situation. Like, sober person. So I love him. I'm so proud of him. And then it was like, oh, well, Ron's clearly going to jail soon. What has he done lately? Like, has Ron done anything to get him in jail now? Um, and and so just time went by, and it ended up that like that bottomless algorithm time warp that happens to us.
Yeah.
And then everybody started clapping. And I looked up, I'm like, oh, sports ball is still happening. Like, imagine that. But what had happened is that Elsie had taken her first step. And I missed it, right? Like, I knew what Snooki's net worth was, but I missed my first daughter's first step. And there was this sadness in that, and this like, oh man, like, I was just not attending to the life that I want to attend to, right? And it made me realize that so much of what's happening to us is just autopilot, right? We just sort of follow the thought that we have in our head, and then we get sucked into the beautiful, shiny rectangle, and then time goes by, and that time starts to amount to our life. And with my older daughter, or with my second daughter, I saw her first steps. I don't remember them, but I don't remember missing them.
Yeah.
And that hurts. There's a sting there, right? And so I really started looking at digital overuse from this new lens of like, oh, our brains are just making these cognitive errors, and we're just getting sucked into this place. And so much of what we need to do is come off of autopilot and choose how we want to live our life. And usually when we do that, it doesn't involve as much of the phone as we currently are using.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, so what we talk about on this podcast is all the different ways that the world has crutches for us to avoid the discomfort, really. And there's so many ways. So, like, I think when we dive into each one of them and looking at what it might be, it's always a surprise. You're like, I had no idea. Like, your eyes glazed over. You're like, wow, I was in zombie mode for what was I doing? Eating that sugar or whatever it was. I was shopping. Like, what is it? So I'm curious as far as just like, let's talk about anxiety for a quick second. I have found it very curious that there are a lot of individuals in my own personal life that and myself as well, that had no idea or still have no idea that they actually have anxiety. It doesn't compute. And so that we have this ongoing joke now with my mom, me and my sister. One day we were over there and we're like watching her chronic anxiety, but it's very not even aware to the degree of facial expressions, talking to inanimate objects and like yelling at things. What are you doing? Stop that. Like this kind of like, oh, like low level anxiety. I'd say high level anxiety, but it's so in her pattern that we said to her one day, we're like, what are you so stressed out about? She goes, what do you mean? I'm not stressed. And she has like, she's doing like six different things. And then she's just like, what do you mean? And her eyes are like, what? And so that was the first time I started to notice my own anxiety. So I started recognizing and seeing it, just like when you recognize, you bought a new car, you start seeing your car everywhere. I was seeing myself and everybody. I'm like, oh my gosh, how long have I been anxious? Had no idea. And how many other people that I work with that there's no way to kindly say, hey, I think that your anxiety is taking over right now. So I'm curious, when you're working with people, and how prevalent this is, that people don't recognize that they actually have it, and for those who do not recognize it, how do you help them, or how do you help someone might be listening, who might be now thinking, well, what if I have it? How do you recognize it?
Yeah. So I think the first step is to understand the prevalence, right? Like 1 in 5 people in the United States could be diagnosed with, like, meet the criteria currently for a clinical anxiety disorder. So this is so common, right? Like, look around in your meeting, see 5 people, one of you has a clinical anxiety disorder. And if you're worried about it, it's probably you, right? Like, it's probably you. Just like if you're worried that you're drinking too much alcohol, you're probably drinking too much alcohol. Like, it's you, it's also you. So there's that piece to recognize that, like, this is a super common thing, clinical anxiety, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Like, anxiety and the presence of anxiety, we are designed to feel it. Like, our brain is designed to feel anxious, and it makes our body do things. It's an emotion, right? It's there's a psychologist named Steve Hayes, and he talks about emotions in terms of the um, oh gosh, Brenda, come on, back to work, girlfriend. That's my mind. Sometimes she clocks out in the middle of a conversation, and that's what's happening right now.
I need to make a name for
Anyway,
my brain. That's great. I love that.
right. She's like very opposed to working like at regular hours of the day. She has no regard for labor laws, but then like she's very aggressively like, no, I have labor rules. There are rules to when I have to work. And I'm like, you literally work like all night and like you don't get paid for that. Like, go to bed, like, you're
Yeah.
good. Anyway, so there's a psychologist named Steve Hayes who breaks down the word emotion in terms of its like Latin roots, right? So like emotion, the word is meant to elicit motion, right? Like that's what the structure of the word is. And so anxiety shows up to make you do something, right? And if we think about the difference between like fear and anxiety, fear is uh, an emotional response to a threat that is happening to you in the moment, right? Anxiety is a cognitive, physiological, and emotional response to something that is happening maybe in the future, right? So fear happens when you are in the water being attacked by a shark. You go into fight, flight, fright. Anxiety happens when you're standing on the beach, looking out at the water, wondering, like, I'm on my period, and will a shark attack me if I go swimming right now? Right?
Yeah.
That's anxiety. So anxiety isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? And if you have anxiety, good. You're a human, your brain works. Love that. Chef's kiss. Um, when it becomes life impairing is when it's time to see somebody like me, right? Like, if it's getting in your way. So if you are worried about saying the wrong thing in a meeting, and that fear is bullying you, or that anxiety is bullying you around, and you don't say anything in the meeting, that's life impairing, right? If you are anxious that your finances are all over the place. And as a result, you're like, we're just not going to look at them, right? That is life impairing. That is going to have a downstream problem. Just like the meeting example, there's going to be downstream problems, right? And that sort of response to anxiety isn't necessarily helpful or functional in the way that anxiety is designed to function. And so, if you are experiencing like physiological arousal symptoms or racing thoughts, or you find yourself constantly thinking about what's going to come next, like, oh my gosh, is this, or if you're doing lots of what ifs, there's a good chance that you are suffering with some form of clinical anxiety disorder, and it's worth talking to somebody about.
Yeah. So I am curious from a perspective. I have a licensed clinical social worker friend who sent me this really interesting therapy that I'm really curious if you know about. So we were talking about the process of anxiety being a body response. So
Mm-hmm.
we were talking about like, so I'm going to share kind of a background here. I had lead poisoning as a kid and then again when I was older. And so my system is really sensitive to different substances. So
Mm-hmm.
I actually had this whole thing for years about my anxiety, like, why am I feeling this way? This doesn't make any sense why I'm feeling this way. When I found out later on that I had like a physiological reaction, like heart rate going up, like toxicity, obviously, like my podcast is about toxicity in many different forms. So it was this kind of journey of detoxing all those things. And I recognized that some of my actual anxiety was from a response of shifts in my physiological makeup and chemistry. And of
Yeah.
course, women, we get that with our cycle. So I'm curious, like, which came first, the chicken or the egg? What does the current psychological industry say about that? And I want to just ask you if you have been aware of this type of therapy that was really interesting that he practices, and it's based on body awareness. Um, it's called intensive short-term dynamic therapy. And
No.
yeah, so he's talking about, it has a really cool conceptualization of anxiety, that it being a body response, or
Mhm.
potentially it being a body response, and using different techniques to. So I was just curious, wanted to ask you about that as
Mm.
a side kind of note. But yeah, tell me about the physical response in the body, and
Yeah.
how that could play back and forth on it. And yeah, I want to hear your take on that.
Yeah. So anxiety is comprised of it's this really interesting constellation of symptoms, right? So it's cognitive symptoms, it's physiological symptoms, and then it's like emotional symptoms, right? And our brains are wonderful packaging devices. Mind, Brenda, she's like, oh, all these things happen at the same time, they go together. Here's your happy meal, right? And so this is one of the things that helps us learning. So there's theory in psychology called relational frame theory that looks at like how we learn things. And anxiety is this learned thing, right? In the same way that when like my daughter Elsie, she's 6.5 right now. We are like, oh, that's a cat, right? And we like point to a cat, and just like, okay, that's a cat. That's a cat. And then over time, we're like, CAT, and we like write it. And then like, okay, so that's a cat, and also this word is cat, even though it's not the fuzzy like squishy thing, but that represents that. And then that gets together, and then the sound cat, like that gets wrapped in. So all of these different things get wrapped together, and that's how learning happens, right? And so anytime Elsie sees a cat, her little Brenda goes in, picks out the letters cat and also the sound cat. It's like, oh, this is your cat happy meal, right? Anxiety is the same thing. And so when we when something happens or a thought shows up, like, oh, what's going to happen, that's just uncertainty, right? And evolutionarily we are designed to like feel like activated when we feel uncertain. And so brain goes, oh, uncertainty, that goes with increased heart rate and like narrowed vision. We're going to need to really focus on all of the threats. Okay, good to know. And then racing thoughts. And so it sort of packages this like anxiety happy meal, right? And so anytime your heart rate goes up, it's also going to bring up the thoughts like, what's going to happen? Am I going to die? And like some like sparks of uncertainty and like fear, right? But like really you're just like running up the stairs, right? Like there's literally no threats happening. Oh geez, Siri.
But it's that
There's
so
lit
but the
Yeah.
association from your
Yep.
history in the memory.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
It's just a memory, right?
Yeah.
And I think that word memory is really helpful, right? Because we know what happens with smells, right? Or with songs. I don't know about you, but like when I hear a song from like, I don't know, mid 90s, I just like I feel like I'm like a kid again and like I'm like, yes, the Tootsie Roll, we are doing this. My daughter's deeply embarrassed, but we're leaning into that, right?
Yes.
And like there's a little bit of shame that comes up when I think about like how I was dancing, but that shame is actually like that shame originated on the dance floor at Pine Hollow Middle School when I was trying to do the Tootsie Roll with like that's not new, or like, you know, like am I going to be accepted if I do the Tootsie Roll right now, right? Like that that all got packaged together, and it also included this song, right? Or with smells, like when you walk past something. Anytime I'm at a fish market, I think about my dad, not because he loved fish markets, but because he knew that I hated them, and so he would take me to them, and just like he was we love him, but he was like a little bit of like a shit starter, right? And so like he would take me there and knew it activated me. I'd be like, Dad, why are we here at this terrible place? You know, it was like this whole thing. And so anytime I smell like a fish market, I'm like, oh, Dad, like Dad gets packaged in with fish market. Dad also gets packaged in with the smell of gasoline, right? And so anxiety, it is this package. And when you have the physiological symptoms, it's also going to bring up all the other stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, because that's my joke with sugar, and my sugar's my addict choice. Like I'm a
Mm,
recovering sugar addict for like 15 years. And
good.
so anytime I would eat sugar, I would go into like completely old Kara mode, like demon bitch mode, where I would turn into a different person. And then I was like thinking about the things, and I want to watch certain movies. It was like a completely different personality. I'm like, what is happening? Because so it's definitely very, very connected. So I'm kind of curious now, like I know we're going to talk more about the digital stuff, but I'm kind of curious if we're kind of segueing then. Okay, if you recognize you might have anxiety, you know, here are the symptoms. What is the treatment? What does exposure therapy look like, and how does that get involved? And then how we can tie that back into the digital aspect of stuff.
Yeah, exposure and response prevention, or just exposure therapy. It's a behavioral therapy. There are many, many years of evidence and research on this form of therapy. And so fundamentally, what before I jump into that, just a real quick like framework for anxiety maintenance, right? Like anxiety is maintained through avoidance, right? Where like we feel a spark of anxiety, we're like, ooh, I don't want to feel this way. And so then we try to avoid feeling anxious, which usually means trying to avoid the thing that made us feel anxious. And sometimes that's functional, right? Like if you see a bear out in the distance, right? Like avoiding the bear is a great idea, right? But like if you are wondering if it's a bear, then in order to learn if it's a bear, you actually have to go out into the world and see like, is this thing a bear, right? And so that's all that exposure and response prevention is like, okay, well, I have identified all of these things are threats in my life, right? Like thinking about making a mistake. So recovering sugar addict, I'm not in active recovery for that. It would be beneficial to my body if I were to. I'm in recovery from alcohol and cocaine and perfectionism, and we're working
It's
towards the sugar
layers.
bit.
It's layers.
It's totally. So like the the perfectionism bit for me, and I'll talk about exposure and response prevention in terms of that, just from a personal level, right? Like I get really afraid of making a mistake, right? And I have a lot of really closely held beliefs about what happens if I make a mistake. What are the consequences of me making a mistake? Clearly, it will mean I'm a colossal failure and people will no longer love me, right? Like, clearly, it will mean I'm incompetent and everything will fall apart and my business will fail, right? Like, there's such, they're old beliefs, right? And they're packaged beliefs. They come up just when I don't know what's going to happen, right? And so what exposure and response prevention has me do is make mistakes and see if this is the mistake that takes me down. Is this the mistake that makes my husband leave me and my children hate me at infinitum? Like, is this it? Right? Is this the mistake that crushes my business by 11 a.m.? I don't know, right? But if I avoid making mistakes, one, it's exhausting and impossible. But two, I never have the opportunity to learn if I can survive making a mistakes. So it's kind of scary, right? The whole premise of exposure and response prevention is to identify the things that are terrifying to you and then to test out the theories that you have on what happens if you do the terrifying thing. But that's also the only way that learning happens. And so it's this really beautiful therapy where all of the stuff that you've been avoiding that has made your life really, really small, you get to start opening your life back up, like step by step. And you start to learn about how resilient you actually are. And there's always this moment of sadness in doing this work with people where they're like, oh my God, I have just been selling myself short for so long. Like, what a bummer that is. And
Yeah.
so um, it's a beautiful therapy. And with anxiety, that's it. You're socially anxious. Guess what? We're wearing ridiculous hats and we're going out in public and we're making a scene and we're going to see if it kills us.
Just attention, folks, if you haven't figured it out yet, no one knows what they're doing. This is actually like, this is the reality of life. So, like, and it's funny to me because, like, so I don't know if you know, I'm a psychic medium, and part of what I do is, I sit there and help people see things about themselves that they can't see, or they don't know, or they sweep it under the carpet sometimes because they're just not aware. It's very clear to me, but it's not clear to them. And part of that whole journey is recognizing that people, all of us, and it helped my anxiety a lot, is like really just allowing myself to get in people's spaces when, of course, when I'm welcome. I don't, just interject and say, let me read your dead grandma. That's completely like psychic drive by, not ethical. But anyway, I'm just
Mhm.
like, oh my gosh, you don't know what you're doing either. Oh, look at
Mhm.
that. Isn't that nice? And then I try to
Yeah.
convince my son, he's 18, like, this is how it is. No one knows what they're doing. But anyway, so I digress, but I have a quick question about the connection to anxiety and energy level. So someone who's
Mhm.
chronically struggling with anxiety, how it affects
Mhm.
obviously their sleep, but people who might be then really anxious to the point where they're like, oh, I think I have a health issue. I think I have chronic fatigue. I don't have any energy. And it might be this, might be that. Have you run into clients that have this? And I feel like I've seen this multiple times. And I just want to know
Mhm.
your expertise and your experience with that connection.
It is a lot of work to fight against anxiety all day, right? Of course, you're tired, for sure. If you stop fighting against anxiety, there's a chance you might not be as tired, right? And you could actually go out and do some things. But you stopping fighting against anxiety actually looks like you going out and doing some things. And so it is this really tricky thing where, in the same vein as like motivation, a lot of people talk about like, oh, I need to be motivated before I do something. But motivation comes after we do the thing, right? Like motivation doesn't get me on my bike. Like it doesn't. Maybe after like 5 weeks of doing a program, my value for commitment gets me on my bike. My value for my health gets me on my bike. That's the thing I look at. I never feel motivated to get on the bike, like, frankly, right? I don't have the energy for it. I've got two kids. One is 2.5. She has recently started potter training. Like, energy, what is that? Right? Like, that's not the thing I'm going to focus on. But for people who are anxious, it's always not always, always is a broad generalization, but it is frequently a focus where if I could just have more energy, this sort of like elusive, mysterious thing that if you can just get your hands on it, then I'll be okay. Then I'm right. There's this contingency built in, and so I think it's also a really difficult thing to treat, especially when it comes to like health stuff. And I'm not a physician, and so
Mm-hmm.
and I work with a lot of people with health anxiety where it's like, oh, if I had more energy, I could go out, or if this, then this, if this, then this. And it's like, well, maybe not, you know. But what we know is that you're actively missing your life.
Mhm.
As you try to struggle with anxiety, you are actively missing your life and you're exhausted. So you have a choice. You're going to be exhausted either way. Either you're exhausted and you're staying inside trying not to feel anxious, or you're exhausted and you're going to the pumpkin patch with your kids. I don't know. I'm going to pick the pumpkin patch and exhaustion, right? Like either way, I'm exhausted. Like, what if you're just tired? And that's not something that you pay attention to
Mhm.
as intently.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a hard sell.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, can you explain a little bit about the concept of psychological inflexibility? I'd love to know about that in general and how that might be related to our habits or patterns or maybe even addictive behaviors.
Yeah, there's a lot of research that shows that when we become rigid in very specific certain psychological processes, we experience higher rates of psychopathology. So, for example, one of our behavioral processes is present moment awareness, right? Are you attending to what's happening here and now? Or are you rigidly fixed in the past or rigidly fixed in the future? Sometime that is then and there, right? And if you are then and there in the past, good chance you're going to feel pretty depressed, right?
Mhm.
If you are then and there in the future, you're going to feel pretty anxious, right? Like that's, but if you're here and now, you might be uncomfortable, you might be sad, you might be frustrated, you might be happy. Here and now is the only time where joy actually gets to exist. But um, being able to attend flexibly is something that is going to promote your psychological wellness. Another behavioral process is experiential acceptance, right? Like, can you accept feeling uncomfortable in this moment? Like, what would happen if the urge to drink is just a wave that you ride and not
Mm.
necessarily something that you have to stop,
Yeah.
right? And and avoidance is the rigid form of that. Like I must get away from this feeling, right? Like I must stop the urge. Good luck, right? Like
Mhm.
good luck. Can't stop the ocean. So there are these processes that become rigid, and a lot of therapy and exposure response prevention especially, but a lot of therapy is designed to make you more flexible in how you behave, which over a period of time just promotes your psychological wellness.
Yeah, I think that flexibility is really crucial to learning too. Like learning in general really is a matter of opening yourself up to the concept of new. This is new. This is
Hmm.
new.
Yeah,
So
be
yeah,
curious.
yeah. Curiosity, I think, is the best state of life consciousness, in my opinion. It's where
Agreed. Like,
fun, openness, concepts of just new ideas can come in. So I want to just appreciate you right now
mm,
for the beautiful, amazing sense of humor that you have, because one of the things I feel that has helped my anxiety is laughter, sense of humor, play, not taking things so seriously because that's not flexible. So I'd love to just kind of ask you a little bit. Did you have like a strong sense of humor your whole life, or like as your anxiety you were processing your own, did you find yourself being less, playful? I'm just kind of curious how that ties in, or even with any of the clients you've worked with.
yeah, but playfulness has been present with me from a very, very young age and has been a way that I have moved through some of my most difficult times. There are times where I've used it inflexibly, right? Like because playfulness and humor is this sort of like diffusing skill. It helps me get a little bit of distance
Mhm.
from the stuff that's going on in my life. Sometimes I use it to keep things like way out there, which is not
Yeah.
helpful,
Yeah.
right? It is helpful in terms of working with clients who do the same thing. Right? Like, oh, I notice we're doing that thing where we make fun of this thing. Are we doing it to hold the thing gently, or are we doing it to get rid of the thing because we hate the thing and we don't want to hear?
Yeah.
Right. And so I'm totally with you on the benefit of humor, the being able to use it in a way that is really functional and light and
Mm.
allows me to connect with the people that I'm working with. Like life is really short and a lot
Mhm.
of the work that we're doing is pretty heavy. Like
Mhm.
if we can't laugh at some of the shit that Brenda comes up with, like we're in big trouble
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
she's an extraordinary storyteller, and like if I can't sit with that, then I don't know that I can teach other people to do the same thing.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think that's what really makes a great therapist, a great helper, anyone who's really walked the talk and done their own work with it. Because even as an instructor or a teacher of any kind, if you have learned your own way, you have a much more innovative, unique approach, a way of teaching as well, which is pretty awesome. So we're looking at the addictive behavior or even just the behavior of avoidance to kind of push away the anxiety. And I think all the substances that we talk about so many things on this podcast, sex, shopping, drinking, sugar, cigarettes, energy drinks, even just work as a way
Mhm.
to avoid the anxiety. So all of these things, they most of them take a little bit longer to either get involved with or to push that buy button on the Amazon shopping cart. Let's kind of talk about the digital aspect of scrolling and the phones or even your computer, because I feel like it's such a quicker hit and it's something that flies under the radar of not even having the awareness that we're even doing it. Or how do you even recognize if you have that habit, because it seems so socially normalized?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. If you're wondering if I have this habit, just look at your hours. I mean, if we want sort of an objective metric of how much you're using your phone, right? Like how frequently you're going into this thing, just the number in your phone's like number keeper, it'll tell you, right? Like I think right now I'm averaging like 2.5 hours a day. I don't really like that number. Some of it, and I notice right now what's starting to happen. But Brenda's like, no, we're good. Like some of that is the baby monitor, Jennie. Like pay no attention to that, right? So right away, when I note like, oh, this is the number makes me feel kind of uncomfortable, right? And then I find myself starting to do the like, oh no, like make the reason giving and the excuses. Like no, it was just one hot tamale, right? Like it was just one shot. It was just like it was this other thing, right? Like look over here. If if that happens for you when you start to think about like how much I'm using my phone, so you think about it, you're like, ooh, and then you excuse it or you rationalize it away. That's an interesting behavior, right? See if you can be curious about that. If that's happening for you, maybe there's a little bit more to look at here, right? Like what happens if we let go of that rationalizing and we just sort of feel the discomfort of how much we're using our phone, right? And if you look at that number and you map that number onto something else. If I were doing Pilates for 2.5 hours a day, one, I would be yoked, like yoked. I would be lifting cars with my like incredible thigh power. I would be doing it. If I was learning a language for 2.5 hours a day, I would be fluent in no time, right? If you map the sheer number of time spent scrolling or time spent um, I know for me when I am most concerned about being a good enough mom, which who isn't, right? But when I'm most concerned about it, that's when I find myself just looking at Pottery Barn Kids, just like I'm just gonna see if they have any new pumpkin or ghost things that I should buy for Halloween to like convince me like then I will be good enough, right? Like when I find myself doing those things, I'm usually suffering with something in the moment and
Mhm.
trying to get away from it, right? And so coming back to that place where it's like, oh, I'm kind of worried about whether or not I'm momming good enough. That's curious. What if instead of perusing the ghost selection at Pottery Barn, what if just a wild thought, what if you just like read to the kids for 10 minutes? Like what if you turn toward them instead of the like quick thing that makes it feel like, okay, no, we're good.
Yeah.
We got ghost stuff in the mail. Like we're solid. They're
Yeah.
gonna love it.
Yeah.
Then they'll know. They'll look at it and they'll know, right?
Yeah.
Like so there's so much of noticing that you're uncomfortable and how quickly that discomfort gets muted by the phone. Whatever you're doing with it doesn't even matter, right? Like there's some muting that's happening. So what happens when you don't mute it? That's what I'm really curious about.
Yeah. I'm really curious about the connection to the epidemic of loneliness and our scrolling and our habits. And of course, when
Mhm.
I was in my scrolling phases, I noticed that I wanted to scroll and look at animals that were cute. And
Mhm.
obviously, I was like, I want cuddle hormones. I need to cuddle with someone. This is why I'm looking at these cute animals.
Yes. a
So,
hundred
and I
percent.
wasn't getting connection. And I'm a massage therapist, so like physical touch is like a huge part of not only my love language, but just I need that. And I think that we
Mhm.
often forget that we're mammals and that that's how our
Mhm.
brain operates. And how are you going to heal trauma? How are you going to heal PTSD or even anxiety when your nervous system just needs to have connection, eye contact, feeling listened to within proximity, and even maybe physical touch if you're comfortable with that. So I'd love to
Mhm.
know your thoughts on that whole thing and the connection there.
Yeah, I think loneliness is, and I'm so glad you brought it up because there's good research that shows that we are more connected through our devices and good research that shows we are way more disconnected through our devices, right? And so how are you using your device to connect is really a good question, right? Like, are you getting it on just to look at cuddly animals and get that little hit of oxytocin that quiets that longing for connection long enough to like move past it? Or are you getting it on and using FaceTime to connect with somebody that you haven't talked to in a long time and actually getting that nourishing experience, right? And so I like to think of the function of the behavior, right? Like if you're using it just to get a hit so you can do the next thing, then maybe that's not something that we want to do anymore. But what is so important is recognizing like, oh man, I am so lonely. Like I am yearning for connection. I want to feel seen and held and to be with people. And when we go into Instagram and we look at stuff, like the feeling is like, oh, connected. I'm looking at her thing. I've seen her kid. I've seen that kid. I've seen, oh, and look at they've got a new job. They did then this, then this, then this. And then you close out and you're still sitting alone on your couch, right? You didn't actually make the meaningful connection that nourishes your body and your mind, right? And so, so much of it is just, it's eating potato chips forever. Like,
Mhm.
love them, would kill for jalapeno, inappropriate to like it, that is an inappropriate response for potato chips, but like I love jalapeno potato chips and like they're so tasty. And also, I could probably live off of them for the rest of my life. There would be some pretty significant consequences, but I might be able to do it. My life will be shorter. I will not be happy with the way that my body looks, which will lead me to eat more potato chips because that's how I deal with the stress, right? And so the thing that's happening inside of you is profoundly meaningful. That longing for connection, we ought to listen to that.
Mhm.
That's the thing that keeps us alive. That's
Mhm.
the thing that keeps our gardens growing.
Mhm.
And if you're lonely and using your phone to connect, take a minute to consider whether or not it actually like satiates that longing or if it's just a jalapeno potato chip.
So I'd love to talk about your book that you wrote, if you want to talk about
Mm.
that. So now I love the title. So it's look up the 30-day path to digital minimalism and real life maximalism.
It's a 30-day challenge, and each day I provide an evidence-based behavioral change strategy for you to practice implementing in your day. So it's designed to build that flexibility we were talking about earlier. And in one of the days, your challenge is to go out and watch people looking at their phones, right? And so it's this mindfulness practice, and it gives you an opportunity to start to see the world that you are missing when you are staring at your phone, right? Because we don't, it's kind of hard to make that connection when we're just looking at our phone. We don't notice all the stuff that we don't notice because we don't notice it, right? But when we go out and we look at the world around us and you just sit on a park bench for 20 minutes and watch people walking by, right? Watch the people that are on their phones and see the stuff around them that they're missing, right? Like see what shows up when you look up from your phone. So it's this very concrete um, behavioral guidance
Yeah.
that I'm offering
Yeah.
people, and all framed around one of the change activities.
So, what are some of the common misconceptions people do have about their digital habits that you clarify in your book?
Mm-hmm. So I think there is a common misconception that you have to have your phone on you all the time. I named it, it's a Quizlet, right? It's a little cute little quiz that you can take that helps you determine if you are on call, if you think you're on call, if you're dependent, or if you're addicted to your phone.
Mm.
So these are four different things, right? Physicians who are on call, right? There are very serious consequences. Like people die if you don't respond within a very quick amount of time. People who are contractually obligated to respond within a very specific amount of time. Like I work with a lot of software engineers, and they are on call often. And if they don't respond within 30 minutes, they lose their job, right? Like there are like HR has written it into the contract that like you are on call at these times. And it's a very specific day, and they know there's a start and there's a stop, right? That's on call. If you think you're on call, that's a different
Yeah.
situation,
Yeah.
right? That's Brenda. She's like, oh, Jenny, we're going to die. People are going to die if you don't respond within like 30 minutes. It's like, no, Brenda,
Yeah.
like literally nobody has died from us not responding in 30 minutes. And
Mm.
also, all of my clients know that I am not an emergency service provider. And so if they have emergent needs, they need to go to the ER. Like that's where they need to go. And they know that, right?
Mm.
And so the book helps you dispel some of the well, helps you identify and then question with this like open, curious non-judgment, like what is that? Isn't that curious? Like, do I need to buy three different size ghosts to hang in my lawn so that my children know I love them? Like, do I, Brenda? Thank you so much, right? Like, do I need to have my phone within arm's length all the time? What happens if it's 2 arms length? Right? Like just starting to get curious. And the book will help you identify if you're on call, if you think you're on call, if you're dependent. So if you're dependent and addiction are different in terms of smartphone use.
Mhm.
Dependence is you have no other means to access the internet. You are actually dependent on your phone to access the internet. And this happens a lot more in communities that have like lower socioeconomic
Mhm.
standing.
Mhm.
If you're addicted to your phone, that's when you're doing funny things like taking your phone to the bathroom with you. Like, do you take your phone potty? If you do,
That's a good one.
let's pause on that.
Yeah.
Like, let's
Yeah.
think about it, right? Like,
Yeah.
can we just take a dump, right? Like, can we just go poop?
That's great.
Can we just poop? So there are some really specific questions that I help you go through, and then it sets you up to start looking at your behavior with this really curious and open and active stance, right? Like I'm doing some curious things with this little rectangle that I didn't really realize and I didn't really notice until I took a pause and started to look.
Yeah. I feel like I'm really dependent on my phone for my music. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I have to put my music on. I'm playing my
Mm.
music while I do my chores, while I eat my food, while I can dance, while I do
Yes.
that. So I feel like I have to have my phone in that way. I'm
Yes.
excited to take your Quizlet, because I'm a business owner, and we over COVID, every business owner had like, walking around with their chicken with their heads cut off, figuring out what to do.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
my journey of re healing my nervous system and from burnout was I had to do the job of 3 4 people. And
Mhm.
so I was on the phone all the time answering messages. Oh, I got to do this, running social media accounts. And it wasn't the
Mhm.
normal operating day-to-day thing, but then it became it. And then now after we're like, oh wait, now things have been delegated again. There's just like, wait a second, I feel like I need to do something. And it's something that I've been still deprogramming myself from. Like, wait, I don't need to answer my phone after 5 o'clock. I don't have to do that anymore. And it's getting
Yeah.
used to that. So I really
Yeah.
am curious about checking out your book and actually including it in one of our upcoming 2025. We have a book club, so I would love to
Fun.
include this. It's a perfect topic. Mind Body Detox. We talk about all these things, and we try to have books that empower ourselves in different areas. So that would be so cool. So yeah. So, but for listeners who are feeling overwhelmed by the idea of cutting back, what would be
Mm-hmm.
some practical first steps you would recommend to just, you said keeping it at arm's length, maybe 2 arms lengths, but what other practical tools or opportunities could we try to make the process more manageable?
Yeah. Look, behavioral change is really, really challenging,
Yeah.
right? Especially something that is as appetitive as your phone, right? This thing is delicious. Mine has my kids on it. And so I look at it and I'm like, ooh, those tasty babies, right? Like it's like I said, it's got Pottery Barn in there. It has all the things that tell me if I'm a good enough parent, right? Like it has my work, right? It's got everything that makes me feel good about myself in there, right? And so I think one important strategy is to adopt the stance that like, oh, changing this might be more difficult than I think it should be, right? And that's okay, right? Like it's okay that it's difficult. It's okay that it's overwhelming. That's just indicative of how finely set in this habit is. Just like finding a new time to brush your teeth would be kind of a big undertaking, right? Like you brush your teeth at the same time every single day. If you don't, give me a call, we'll work on that, right? But like it is really hard to change a habit. So fortunately there's a book for it, and like this book will help you change your habits. And so I'm tempted to be like, oh, do this, do this, do this. And I think that like you can make these little practical changes. Like you can take, so one of the change activities that I offer is to do like 3 minutes of thoughts before you log into your phone, right? So as you go to grab your phone, you set your timer for 3 minutes, and then you just sit there and like notice your thoughts for 3 minutes. And then after that, get into your phone and do whatever you're going to do, right? If you don't have 3 minutes to do that, you don't actually have time to get into your phone. Like there's no point in getting into your phone, right? And so there are these little micro interventions that you can introduce, and they're not going to be the thing that categorically changes this behavior or that changes the behavior in the long term, right? And so I think it's really important as you're considering this, one, to know that this challenge doesn't actually have you go 30 days without your phone. It doesn't have you reduced to a point where it is unrealistic or unworkable or undoable. And it doesn't come from this place of judgment, right?
Yes.
Like this is really hard stuff to do,
Mhm.
and everybody who's done it has survived, which
Mhm.
is great news for my malpractice insurance. Like nobody has died yet from doing the challenge, um, and there will be days where you don't do the challenge, right? Middle of the challenge, you might be like, I hate this. I don't want to do this anymore. And that's okay too. It's a very compelling thought. If you listen to that thought, you're likely not to do it. If you're like, oh, isn't that curious that like in the middle of this thing, I'm having this thought that I don't want to keep doing it. Okay, can I keep doing it anyway? Like, can I see how this is important to me and keep doing it anyway? So I think the the most challenging part of behavioral change is letting go of the idea that we could just switch it on or off
Mhm.
and like move it along, sister, right? And so there's little strategies you can do moment to moment, like I mentioned, doing like 3 minutes of thoughts before, but adopting a radical stance of kindness about how hard this might be the first most important step
Mhm.
in actually making some long-term changes.
I completely agree with that in any area of life you're looking to change, because I think we have such a self perception of judgment, or the other people are judging us, and then shame, and then all that perpetuates behaviors. It really, really does, and unrealistic expectations of how quickly it's gonna we're gonna change this overnight, or oh my gosh, I failed, I haven't been able to do this correctly. And I see that with every single thing that we do
Mhm.
in Mind Body Detox in the program we have, but then all the guests bring up, I'm like, this is the same thing, everybody. Y'all, you've heard this before. It's the same thing. Take your time. If you're like, I'm going to tackle my phone next, cool. But
Mhm.
just keep yourself in a realistic, curious mindset to say, how long wait, what can I do today? I think that's really a really healthy place to be. And like you said, we don't have long here. So there's not much time to explore and experience this world. So, really, even if you struggle for the rest of your life with it, okay, well, you still enjoyed your life doing something. I think that's a,
Yeah.
a big thing that we often forget. So I have two final questions that I ask all of our guests the first time they come on the show. But before we go into those final questions, I want to give you space to, like, anything else that you want to cover, to put out there, to share with us regarding this topic, or yourself, or your practice, or your book.
Yeah, I mean, I think just reinforcing what you're saying about how hard it is to change behavior and not trying to do everything overnight all at once, right? Like I shared earlier, like I'm in recovery from cocaine, I'm in recovery from alcohol, I am a recovering perfectionist, and I'm just not ready to be in recovery from sugar yet,
Yeah,
right? Like hot tamales are very much still a part of my life,
yeah,
and like
yeah.
yo, that's okay, right?
Yes.
And so I'm I think those of us who are more oriented towards like self-improvement and really like refining who we are, like we also fall into that trap of like if we're not improving something, then like what am I doing?
Yep.
And so back to that place of kindness,
Yeah.
like it's so hard to be a human. It's so hard. And then you put a mind in us and it gets even harder, right?
Yeah.
Like Brenda is so helpful sometimes and so unhelpful other times. And we just love her all the time. So, I think radical acceptance, radical kindness, and radical open curiosity are the stances to adopt for any situation.
And that goes along with my motto. You guys, guests, listeners, have heard me say this again. My purpose in life is, how do I embody radical love, radical self
Mm.
love? And it includes, every day it's different. And it's just doing the best I can with, how can I love myself more? How can I love others more, in all these different ways? So, yeah. Well, let's go into these final questions. So, the
Sure.
first final question is, what is your favorite product, wellness topic, or self care indulgence at this time?
I am this is part of my radical acceptance. I'm failing miserably at self-care right now. I am failing. I am overbooking myself. I am um like I'm working late. I'm working later than I want to work. Um
Are you having
I
some fun doing it?
I'm having so much
I
fun,
was
which is
gonna
part of the
say, that's
problem.
exactly
It's
it. Yeah.
It's very reinforcing,
Yes.
right? And that's one of the problems with perfectionism is that
Yes.
like I kind of love it, right?
Yes.
Like we kind of love it. So something that I am working toward, which feels very self-indulgent and is also just a framework for living. Something that I'm working toward is just like a set 4-day work week.
Yeah.
It like I don't want to work on Fridays, and that's it.
Yeah.
That's it. That to me sounds so nice. And what I would do on that Friday, I would laze around and I would read Murder Club. I would Thursday Murder Club, which is one of my favorite books right now. I would go to like Mega Reformer Pilates. That sounds amazing. I would do 2.5 hours of Pilates in a single day. It would be too much. I should not do that much. I would take up running, right? Like there are all of these health oriented things that
Mhm.
I would start to integrate into my life. Um and I am saying out loud that that is something I need to actively move toward with more clear strategy.
Yeah.
Because right now I'm just sort of like, yeah, this is what I'm in that dreaming
Mhm.
phase,
Mhm.
but I don't have a plan to
Yeah.
actually make that happen for me. And so maybe that's actually the most self-indulgent product that would that would be great for my life is to plan.
I love that you're stirring up the cloud right now. Just stir up the cloud and then start pulling shit down from it and then make it into the plan. And I think being
Mhm,
an entrepreneur is really, the possibilities and then of course the action steps, and then you start to see the payoff of like, whoa, this is actually coming towards me. I'm getting more free time, or I'm going to potentially get more free time. My own recovering perfectionist as well, and the workaholism that it leads into. Of like, whoa, this is really happening. Oh my gosh, now I have more free time, and so the payoff is there, and it's just, for my own self, I completely understand that it's setting more of that boundaries around my time, and just kind
mhm,
of fitting everything into a little bit more of a smaller pocket, instead of like, I could just do a little bit more today, and that would
mhm,
feel good, and then the dopamine would be right there, and then I'd be like, wow. So I understand self-care, especially for going, like I said earlier, going from doing five people's jobs, and now my
mhm,
nervous system's like, how do I recover? Um, it's definitely like there's still the propensity to go and dive into that. So yeah,
mhm, mhm.
yeah. I wish that for you. I think
Thank
it's
you.
it's something that it just keeps the perseverance. It's there, and then the action plan. So stirring up that dream cloud, then pulling it down and making it real. So the last
Mm.
question is, if you could detox one thing in your life or the world right now, what would it be?
I would detox the 24-hour news cycle. I would revert us back to like 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. news, or whatever the like, that to me, like we've had enough. We've had enough. We've had enough. I would detox that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
yeah, my whole thing with the news is it's just, it continues to perpetuate fear and anxiety and putting our nervous systems into this like fight or flight state where we can't make good decisions, and it's addictive. It's another addiction.
Totally.
So,
Totally. And so
yeah.
then we go back to it to make sure that everything's still okay or everything's not okay.
Yeah.
And then it is such a safety behavior that keeps us stuck in that anxiety maintenance
Yeah.
model. And I would just be done with that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to ask if there's anything that of course, we're going to put your information about your book,
Mm,
website, everything in the show notes. Anything as far as working with you, information you might have on your website, place, where your coordinates for following you. What kind of information do you want to share with everybody? Because I have a feeling everyone wants to probably follow up with you.
Oh, I hope so. So you can buy the book on Amazon. It's called Look Up, A 30-Day Path to Digital Minimalism and Real Life Maximalism. You can hit me up on the Instagram. It is Becoming Jennie. And I will disclose that as another indulgent product that I use is not Instagram, but is a marketing company to manage my Instagram. So I get on and I say, hey, what's up every now and then. And like it will be me responding, but it's actually not me posting. So that's a nice thing for me. Um, and if you're needing therapy, I'm at the West Coast Anxiety Clinic. So it's just westcoastanxiety.com. I'll send you the Quizlet so you can post it in your show notes and people can have a try, see what happens.
That's perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming on. It's such a
Yeah,
pleasure
you bet.
meeting you and interviewing you.
I feel the same. Thanks
Yeah.
for having
Yeah,
me.
absolutely. All right, listeners, thank you again. We appreciate you, love you, and be well until next time, my friends.